Is there hope for the Rawlsian voluntaristic conception of the good? To find that out, let us now specifically examine the agency and the role of choice in order to redeem the concept of the good. And in this part, Michael J. Sandel is giving too much elbow space for the theory or the conceptions of John Rawls in order to provide a reasonable criticism and reasonable description of it. So basically, choice is an exercise of agency. Products of choice and decision are values and conceptions of the good. So the question is that how does choice consists in and how I come to make it? According to Rawls, choice rests on our direct self-knowledge. Choice only in a peculiar sense of the word. In other words, what we want and how do we want it based on pre-existing desires and want. Hence, not really a choice at all because, contrary with the voluntaristic claim, since it is only superficial introspection, also it is choosing from existing wants and desires based on how I can satisfy them with the existing ways of the social circumstance. So, Michael J. Sandel, out of his goodness, presented two resorts for Rawls. Resort number one is a purely preferential choice, and resort number two is a purely arbitrary choice. So the resort number one goes like this. Introduce the idea that persons are capable of reflecting on their desires, not only in the sense of assessing their intensity, but also in the sense of assessing their desirability. And resort number two, imagine a case in which the various desires of the agent, properly weighed for the respective intensities, led to a tie and where the deliberation had already taken account of all relevant preferences, such that no further preferences could be introduced to break the tie. However, resort number two does not go smoothly with the Rawlsian idea since it rejects the arbitrary form of agency. Radical choice has no place in justice as fairness because the good or the conception of the good is heteronymous throughout its entire conception. So, in other words, purely preferential choice cannot save Rawls' conception of the good in the voluntarist sense, since it confuses choice with necessity by setting up another second order set of desires. And the purely arbitrary choice cannot save also Rawls' conception of the good in the voluntarist sense, since it confuses choice with caprice, or as what have been mentioned earlier, radical choice has no place in justice as fairness. So, what's the status of the good now? What's the status of the moral theory of Rawls if it can't be salvaged with those exhaustive resorts given by Michael J. Sandel for the Rawlsian theory? This is the answer. Theory of the good is difficult morally and epistemologically. This reveals a problem in connection with the right, distinguishing a standard of assessment from the thing being assessed. Especially that the concept of the right does not extend to private morality, so values and ends must have independent sanction and not just there because I hold them in a certain intensity. The response of Rawls is that these are not at the mercy of one's interest. However, this theory of the good does not really involve or extend to private morality. So it has been exposed by Sandel, according to his analysis of such conception, that deontological liberalism accepts an essential utilitarian of the good. And in other words, the Rawlsian theory or of morality, the Rawlsian justice as fairness, includes subtly a particular version or shade of utilitarianism. So here's the analysis. The concept of the good is diminished. It follows that the status of justice is called into question as well. It has been shown that the concept of good is arbitrary, so why must the highest of all virtue, which is justice, should be the one to enable us to pursue these arbitrary conceptions as fully as circumstances permit, since justice is considered as a good, and the theory of good, the Rawlsian theory of good, is not coherent at all, is diminished. So why must we put in a high regard this conception of justice of the Rawlsian system? Hence, this gets us back to the original concern, which is the primacy of justice. So all those mental gymnastics brought us back to our main concern, which is the Rawlsian claim of the supremacy or the primacy of justice. And before we go on, let us re-examine, let us have a review of the circumstances regarding this primacy of justice in the original position of the Rawlsian justice as fairness. So, distinctiveness of the self in the original position is a circumstance surrounding justice. Assumptions in particular and empiricist rendering of justice undermines in general the primacy of justice. Why is that so? Because first, justice depended for its virtue on the existence of certain empirical preconditions. The virtue was no longer absolute as true to theories, but only conditional. Second, it presupposed a rival virtue of set of virtues of at least correlative status. Third, assumed in certain circumstances a remedial dimension. And fourth, it made it appear justice as a vice rather than a virtue. So going back, this distinctiveness or separateness of the self in the original assumption is the key assumption of mutual disinterest. The notion that the individuals take no interests in one another's interests. So yeah, justice depended for its virtue on the existence of certain empirical preconditions. The virtue of justice was no longer absolute as truth theories, but only conditional as physical courage is to a war zone. So, aside from this criticism of Sandel against this claim of the primacy of justice, we have David Hume's account of the circumstances of justice, which is contradictory. And ironically, Rawls adapted some elements of it, but in reality, it is contradictory to the Rawlsian claim of the primacy of justice. Because here's what Hume claimed. If a man had a tender regard for another, which i.e. benevolence, and if nature supplied abundantly all our wants and desires, then there's no need for justice. Response of Rawls: it's not that we do not love one another. We antecedently don't know anything in anyone, hence the need for primacy of justice. In these contexts, virtues implied by Hume as more primary than justice thus need justice in order to properly work in these contexts. Here's Sandel's response. The problem is that even after the original position, Rawls' citizens cannot be fully transparent to themselves and are opaque to others. Hence, if Rawls' justice continue to be understood in the circumstances of the self as separate in the cognitive sense, the primacy of justice would diminish even if opacity faded and the sense of community deepened. So, unfortunately, these criticisms are very reasonable and plausible, very strong against these claims, against the entire conception of the Rawlsian theory of morality. Justice is fairness, and the claim that the justice is superior among other virtues. Hence, there is a need, there is really this one last need to really go back to the question, what is justice? How can we say that a society is just? So here is the answer of Rawls according to this justice as fairness. A society is just if that society is of a certain kind, ordered in a certain way such that justice describes its basic structure and not merely the dispositions of persons in that structure. In that society, justice must be constitutive of its framework and not simply an attribute of certain of the participants' plans of life. So, this answer has been the basis when Sandel derived his own inquiry on when we can call a society as a community. So there's some structural derivation from that answer from society as just. And here's the answer of Sandel. A society is a community if that society is of a certain kind, ordered in a certain way such that community describes its basic structure and not merely the dispositions of persons in that structure. In that society, community must be constitutive of the shared self-understanding of the participants and embodied in their institutional arrangements and not simply an attribute of certain of the participants' plans of life. So that's the entirety of the Rawlsian conception of justice and the good if applied to a society, to a community, specifically speaking. And the conclusion that we can derive from it is that utilitarianism in such account fails to take seriously our distinctness. Hence the Rawlsian political philosophy renaissance. But the Rawlsian renaissance in political philosophy, which is the justice is fairness, failed also to seriously take our communality. Both are extremes, and Michael J. Sandel here is proposing his own communitarian conception of justice, of society, of community, which does not go to the extreme of disregarding the distinctness of the self, but does not also go to the extreme of erasing or erasing the community involvement or the unity of the self to the community. That would be all, and thank you. This has been Charles John Rosales, your reporter for the justice and the good of Michael J. Sandel. Have a nice day, everyone. God bless.